Hello and welcome to the Of Interest podcast. We're joined today by a very excellent guest, Peter Dunne, former leader of United Future and now a political commentator. And we're going to talk through the process of coalition negotiations, of which you, Peter, have done 5?
That's correct, yes. Hi.
That's quite a number. Thanks for coming on.
Yes, it's more than anyone else actually, which I find quite interesting in the current context.
So arguably you're New Zealand's most experienced coalition negotiator.
Well, as I say, I've done more than anyone else.
But you haven't got a call from anyone to be their champion?
No, I haven't, no. And I wouldn't expect to, because these things are all in the moment and they move on. So, what happened last time or the time before is really not relevant to what happens now.
So that's something I was very keen to ask you is there a framework, is there a normal process that goes through it, or is it just sort of ad hoc based on what different coalitions, interests and dynamics are?
It's more ad hoc than organised. Mm-hmm. The negotiations I was involved in tend to follow a similar pattern, but they always rely on the leader of the party who's likely to lead the government making the first approach.
Okay.
And then what happens is we have a sort of a get-together, usually 2 or 3 days after the election, to scope what the possibilities might be, what sort of a relationship they might be interested in, what sort of relationship we might be interested in. Mm-hmm. What are the issues that are on the table? National was always more up front and saying, these are the 4 or 5 key things we've got to get through.
Okay.
If we can get your support on those, then what can we trade on the other side? Mm-hmm. Labor was a bit more wary. I don't think it saw its agenda as sort of that automatically negotiable. Then what you do after that is you say, oh yeah, okay, I think there's sort of scope here. You might have a discussion about what are particular priorities on your side versus their side. And then the chiefs of staff normally go away and start to nut together what looks like a draft agreement.
Okay.
And then you come back and you talk that through and you haggle over the bits and pieces and get the figures that you might need or the details.
When you got that call, did you go into those negotiations with a policy or a win in mind that you were going for, or was it about finding alignment?
A bit of both. You always have some things that you want. You see you've got the opportunity to achieve. So I always took the view that as a minor party we couldn't overplay our hand. On the other hand, we couldn't sell ourselves too cheaply. So what were the things, the 2 or 3 key things that we wanted to get out of that? And what were we prepared to either sort of draw the line in the sand on the other side, or say, look, don't like that, but it's not the end of the world. If you want to pursue that, we're not going to stand in your way. And that sort of give and take. It was never a case of saying, here's our manifesto, take it or leave it.
Yeah.
There was always a bit of trade-off. And I think there were a couple of occasions where things that we were promoting that the larger party sort of wanted to do but felt it couldn't promote, it was quite happy to let us do it. So we got a win-win out of it. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any examples of policy wins or things you scuttled?
Well, I can give you a couple of examples. This one involves Labour, and that was we were very keen to bring in public-private partnerships for roading development with an eye to the development of the Transmission Gully motorway.
Which is great, by the way.
Yep, thank you. Labour's position was interesting. This was Helen Clark, Michael Cullen time. They were not opposed to PPPs, but they felt they couldn't sell them, particularly because they had a relationship with the Greens, who were vehemently opposed to such things. They found it quite easy to be able to say to the Greens, well, we've done this deal with United Future and PPPs are going to be a possibility, depending on the circumstances, knowing they couldn't have done it by themselves. So that sort of thing. And we wanted them because we wanted to be able to say, well, here's how you build that motorway. In the end, when the Nats came in, they said, no, we'll just fund it directly. So the issue didn't arise. But the important point there was both of us wanted something. We could be the ones up front advocating for it. Labour was quite happy to get that. I think on the other side, the 2014 election was interesting because on the night, National had won an outright majority. And I remember John Key calling me and saying, look, we're not going to need you guys, Act or the Māori parties we'd had previously, but because we've worked together over the last 6 years, we're happy to keep you on. Mm-hmm. But we won't be making any concessions to you.
Okay.
So all we'll be seeking from you is confidence and supply, and we'd like to wrap this all up pretty quickly, which happened by about the Monday or the Tuesday of the following week. I checked in with both the Māori Party and ACT to find that they'd been made similar offers, and they both said to me, what are we going to do? And I said, I reckon we take them. But bird in the hand always worth two in the bush. We did. About 10 days later, the Specials came in and National lost a couple of seats and its outright majority. And suddenly realised that they had a bit of a problem. They came back to us and said, look, we think we need to renegotiate those agreements. And I said, no, we've got a signed piece of paper here.
Yeah.
And I went to the other two and said, we need to stay the line on this, which we did. So National ended up in the worst of all worlds, really, where it had supply partners it wasn't conceding anything to, but all it was getting from us was confidence in supply. Everything else had to be negotiated case by case.
Okay.
And that made for an interesting 3 years. It worked, but if they'd been a little less impatient and waited till the Specials, they could have, from their point of view, got better deals. So that's just some of the dynamics.
Interesting. So do you think National might have learned that lesson, and that's one reason why they're seemingly partially holding off for the special votes before finalising any agreements? They're talking, but...
Yeah, I think that's possible. I think that in 2014 they just jumped the gun a wee bit early. I don't think they expected to lose seats and suddenly found they'd lost a couple, and then, as I say, all bets were off. I think it's prudent for them to wait until they know exactly what they're dealing with, because if the challenge for them becomes if they emerge after the Specials with a 1-seat or 2-seat majority, they don't need New Zealand First, but do they still take the insurance policy, and what's the price? That's, I think, the calculation for them, and they want to know, in a way, just what the price is going to have to be when the time comes.
Christopher Luxon has put quite a lot of emphasis on these talks being private and not wanting them to play out in the media. Some of the media have got a bit upset about that, as media tend to do. What do you make of that? Aren't these talks always secretive? They
are, but I think they have become a circus in recent years when you've had the traipsing to and fro across this building with microphones and the people camped out in as it used to be, the foyer of Bowen House waiting for any development. I remember one year, I can't remember which year it was, but there was a electronics shop on the ground floor down there, and I wanted to buy something new for my computer at home, and I came out at lunchtime and was followed by the media packers and great thing out the front door into the shop when I bought this thing and went back up to my office. They really thought they were going to get something, but I was just going out to buy, as I say, something for my computer at home. I think that's the sort of circus side of it that Luxon's reacting against. He wants to be able to do this privately. And I think there's one other factor. I thought when he said at the beginning he was not going to be saying anything to anyone, I thought he was also sending a pretty clear warning to ACT and New Zealand First, and don't you either. Because if you look at New Zealand First's track record, they like to control negotiations. They like to be the ones that sort of indicate where things are at, and they always announce who they're going with. I think it's been an edifying spectacle both for Jacinda Ardern in 2017 and for Jim Bolger way back in 1996 to be hanging around literally waiting to hear at the same time as the rest of us which one was going to become Prime Minister. The bronze medal winner shouldn't tell the gold and silver medals who they are. And so I think Luxon's trying to guard against all that sort of thing happening again.
Right, so he's not so much telling the media, I'm not going to talk to you, he's indirectly telling the other parties, don't talk to the media.
Yeah, and I'm in control of these negotiations.
It's interesting. I totally think that's a good way to go about it, and I respect that. But it is a little bit frustrating as the media, for 2 weeks, you have nothing to write about.
I agree, and but that's, in a way, probably the way it should have been right from the outset. We've got used to the sort of the daily parade of, what does that shrug of the shoulders mean, or that raised eyebrow mean, or that little aside mean, and trying to read into them all sorts of things that aren't there. Normally these negotiations proceed quite quickly and quite smoothly. I remember in 2002, the first negotiations I did, we completed them, and Helen Clark said she was going to take a holiday for a week. And then when she came back, we'd do the formal announcement. That was fine, and everyone kept very tight, except about the following evening, I turned on the late TV news to hear TVNZ reporting that the talks had been completed, a deal had been agreed, and they didn't quite have the full story, but they had most of it.
Something had happened.
And it was fascinating because it was a young journalist at the time who, I don't know how she got the story, but she had. But no one else believed her. It only ever ran once before she was sort of told, no, that's nonsense, and the whole thing disappeared.
Right.
But I was there thinking, who's talked? And I still don't know.
Right.
I've talked to her subsequently. I still don't know how it happened. But there was a real moment of panic there when you think this whole thing's been blown apart. But we were saved by the fact that no one else believed it.
So it's interesting to hear you say that often these things go quite quickly and smoothly. If you had to hazard a guess, how soon after November 3rd, when we get the final votes, do you think we could have a government, or is that too speculative?
No, I don't know, obviously, but I think pretty quickly. I think what we're going to find is that the deals will have been largely done and just need to be finalised once the final figures are in. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One is I think that's probably Luxon's style. But there's a second reason. Parliament's got to sit by mid-December at the latest under the law.
Yeah.
And the Governor-General has made it clear that if there is not a government in place by that time, Parliament still has to sit, there still has to be a state opening, she still has to deliver a speech from the throne, which would be prepared by the caretaker Prime Minister, which would be a nonsense. So I think there's a time pressure to get this over, probably by mid-November at the absolute latest, so that all these other processes can start to take place, that Parliament can sit by mid-December, and that the government does have a legislative program to start to progress at that point. If it can't do that, I mean, I don't think we'll get to the scenario where the Labour Party is still technically in power at that point, but if it dragged on any later, there'd be a real rush, and I think it would look, the new government would have lost the opportunity to sort of set out its agenda and maybe introduce a couple of key bills before Christmas. And I just don't think they'll let that happen.
Right. So the three parties might be coming to some sort of arrangement on they probably have a pretty good guess as how the specials will play out after they come out. They might be able to announce that quite quickly, potentially.
I would think so. Within a couple of days or so. And I think what Luxon clearly has in mind is that he will announce it at that point. And that's I think that's entirely as it should be. But he's clearly sending the sign that he's controlling this by having them, privately in Auckland, by sending all these signals about people keeping quiet. He's going to be the one that says, I can now form a government composed of the following bits and pieces. Yeah,
I do remember being in a supermarket, and it must have been 2017 when Winston Peters was making his decision announcement. I was sort of holding a phone to my ear, listening to RNZ as I went through the checkouts, and it was very memorable, and it was wonderful theatre.
Oh, yeah.
But in terms of the democratic process, maybe it's a little bit topsy-turvy.
Well, it's led me to, I've got a view which is not relevant in this context, but I don't like the process of parallel negotiations.
Okay.
And New Zealand First always had that. I think that the rules need to be changed, and I accept that the Governor-General shouldn't be involved, except for one step. I think after an election, the Governor-General should go to the leader of the largest party and invite that leader to form or to attempt to form a government and give them, 21 days or something to do so. If they can within that period, well and good. If they can't, then they either go back to the Governor-General and say, hey, we're close to a deal, can I have an extension? Or we can't do it, at which point the Governor-General then invites the second leading party to say, well, can you do it?
Interesting.
But I just don't think it's appropriate to have, I'm talking to you in the morning and you in the afternoon, you've offered this, what are you going to counter it with? And that sort of auction by the minor party. And I think, just if the Governor-General just kicked the process off by saying, and all she would have needed to do in this case was to say on Sunday morning, I will be inviting Mr Luxon to attempt to form a government.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, that brings me to a relevant question, which is, what is it that defines how much you as a minor party can ask for? Is it just how many seats you've got, or is it, as you say, how much leverage there is? Can you play people off?
I think it's how much influence you've got, which may not necessarily relate to seats.
Okay.
I found myself on a couple of occasions having just one seat, but considerably more influence because it was the seat that made or broke the government.
Okay.
On other occasions, if you've got more seats, you might just be part of the crowd, so to speak. So the trick then is to work out, if you're in that situation, what is a responsible course to take? Because the public don't like tails wagging dogs. So what can you reasonably get, and what can you reasonably prevent or moderate? And that's obviously case by case, situation by situation. Knowing always that what happens in those situations is that if you're the key vote and controversial legislation passes because of your key vote, it's all your fault.
Okay.
It's not the government that promoted it, it's your fault. You could have stopped it. Equally, if something that you've wanted passes by one vote, the government's achieved that.
Okay.
And you're always in that bind of being responsible for the bad stuff and yet not getting the credit for the good stuff that you've promoted.
Yeah.
And that's just life.
It's very interesting. It might be a coincidence, but ACT, they were polling very well, then declined towards the end. That decline came shortly after they made some comments about how they're going to be really tough in negotiations and possibly even not go into coalition. And it may just be a coincidence, but that did seem to be an unpopular statement. People started worrying about the stability of the government, and it seemed like they lost votes around then. It might be a coincidence.
No, I think it's more than coincidence. I'd felt for some time, probably from about July, that ACT was overplaying its hand a little bit. You need to wait for the votes to be counted to know exactly what your influence is going to be. ACT was talking, I think, far too loudly about how it was going to control, basically, we'll be the spine for this incoming government, all that sort of stuff. I think people don't like that. So when they started to then say, well, we mightn't even join it, in an environment where the mood was clearly for change, I think that did count against them, and people thought we can't risk that. So they either went to national, or I suspect after Christopher Luxon's welcoming of New Zealand First, they went there.
Yeah, and it seems like they've really moderated their tone now to the point that I think David Seymour's even said, I could sit around a cabinet table with Winston Peters, which previously was out of question.
Yes.
How did you find it being a minister outside of cabinet? How important is that distinction?
It's not that great, really, because under both governments, I always went to Cabinet when I had items that needed attention. I went to Cabinet on other occasions where there were major issues being discussed, or foreign leaders present, that type of thing. I actually found in a funny sort of way that being outside gave you just a wee bit more freedom. You could do your own thing to a much greater extent, knowing that you'd have to front to Cabinet eventually. And one of the things that we always had in our agreements was a regular meeting with the Prime Minister, probably once every 3 weeks or so. And I always used that to promote things and make sure that when I had stuff that was going to Cabinet, I had the support of the Prime Minister.
Okay.
And I remember one occasion with John Key where he pledged his ultimate support for me on something, and the Cabinet discussion was going anywhere but the way I wanted it, and I was thinking, so much for your support, mate, when suddenly he just said, yeah, well, I'm in favour of this. And the whole mood changed. And the thing went through. So I always found it easy to, very important to get the PM on side.
Okay.
And then, in a way, it didn't matter if you weren't necessarily part of all the other backroom discussions. You were there when it counted, and you knew who was backing you.
Yeah, that's interesting. It brings me to another thing. Luxon has said that, while they wait for the special votes to come in, they've been working a lot on just the relationship and the chemistry. I think he's particularly talking about between him and Peters, who don't really have much of a history. How important is that personal relationship when it comes to forming a coalition, or the chemistry?
It's absolutely critical.
Okay.
There's got to be mutual trust.
Yeah.
I was very fortunate in that I had known and deeply respected Helen Clark for a long number of years, and we've always got on extremely well at a personal level. I think the feeling was, I'd like to think it was mutual, and we were able to have a very direct and straight relationship. I developed that with John Key to the same extent, and it's critical where, you're almost, you can be in a position where they might want to sound off to you about some of their frustrations, not about you, but about some of the other things that are going on, and knowing that you're not going to sort of betray that to colleagues, because they're not your colleagues as such, but that you're a safety valve, and you've got to be able to have that relationship where they can trust you to do what needs to be done, and trust you not to go out there and sort of pull the pin or do anything silly.
At the start of your career, you were a Labour MP. How did that play out in terms of, did Clark therefore see you as being a fellow party member? To
some extent, I think she did. I remember because one of my great friends and rivals in the Labour Party had been Michael Cullen. We had this funny odd relationship. We were very good friends, but we were also conscious that we were both sort of angling for the same job in the finance area. And in 2005, when I became Minister of Revenue and he was Minister of Finance, he came across to see me, and he made a very interesting comment. He said, it's going to be interesting, blah, 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 sort of after all the pleasantries, and then he said, I always knew it would come to this. And I think that was a sort of a recognition that Michael and I probably disagreed about more than we agreed on.
Okay.
But we respected each other, and we worked on the basis always of making sure that in any sort of presentation we were doing, all sides of the argument were heard. And that at the end of the day, whoever was looking in couldn't say, well, he won that one or he won that one, because everything was out there. We did a Holmes interview at one stage on the prospective sale of Air New Zealand to Singapore Airlines. Cullen was in favour, I think, and I was against. And we knew the Holmes format would be to set... Holmes was going to take the populist against view.
Okay, yeah.
And it would be... the way he set it up would be the two of us on Cullen. That was always the way he worked, 2 on 1. So Michael and I decided beforehand that we wouldn't buy into that. We'd just make sure that all the arguments were put out there.
Okay.
And so the interview was very much, well, Peter's right when he says this. Yes, I agree with Michael when he says that. And Holmes was getting very frustrated. So, that sort of thing works. I think with Key, we developed a good friendship, and that meant that a lot of stuff happened. Not quite that way, but in a sort of a vein where you sort of knew instinctively where the other was going to go.
Because I guess my next question was, did Key therefore see you as a Labour man, and was that relationship harder to build?
No, I don't think so. If he did, he never conveyed that to me. No, the relationship was quite easy to build, really. I was lucky when he'd first got elected to Parliament. I was invited to go to Taiwan for the inauguration of the President, and the National Party was invited to send someone along as well, and they sent John Key, who was this very young MP. So we had this trip away together, which was very good for sort of bonding a relationship at that point, and just, we carried on over the years subsequently.
That's useful. In terms of Act and New Zealand First in this arrangement, how much negotiating power do you think they have? Because Act obviously got quite a good chunk of votes. New Zealand First is there and is needed, or it looks like they will be needed, but then they have nowhere else to go.
Yeah.
What do you think about the sort of negotiating dynamics this time?
I think, in a way, Act and New Zealand First are in similar positions. Neither have anywhere else to go. And consequently, the expectation is they will reach an agreement. So that puts National into a stronger position. It doesn't have to give away too much, knowing that the onus is actually on its two partners to come to the party. I think New Zealand First problem is particularly more acute because they're sort of at one step removed. If they're seen to be the problem, they'll pay the electoral price.
Right.
And I think that's something they'll be mindful of. They should also be mindful of, and so should National, that no government that's ever involved New Zealand First in any shape or form has survived beyond 3 yees.
Okay.
So, if I was National thinking about 2026 and beyond, I'd be thinking, how can we position this that we don't have the same thing happen to us as happened to National in 99, Labour in 2008, the breakup of the coalition in 2017.
Yeah. Right, and should I surmise from that you're suggesting that keeping them a little more at arm's length might be better?
Well, that's I think National's preference. Right. How they can do that remains to be seen. On the one hand, New Zealand First will say, if you need us, you'll pay us, frankly.
Yeah.
On the other hand, New Zealand First might say, but hang on, we can't afford not to be there.
Yeah.
So that's where the trade-off is going to be. And it'll be really interesting. Luxon seems to be drawing very heavily on his commercial experience as a negotiator. It doesn't always transfer to the political environment, but this is going to be very interesting, I think, to see just how far he can utilise that skill to get a deal that sort of keeps everyone in the right place.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, people often say running a company isn't the same as running a country, but I guess a negotiation is a negotiation in some sense.
Yeah. And he'll know from his background, he talks about mergers and acquisitions, that the trick is to get a deal that everyone feels happy with, even if one side's had the skin pulled off its back. Because
of course, if you feel like you have been shortchanged, you're going to be very unhappy sitting there in an outside cabinet throwing stones the whole time. Right. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Another thing that struck me as interesting this election, and it's actually would have been more of a problem for the left maybe than the right, but this idea of does a policy need a majority mandate to be passed? And here I'm thinking specifically about the wealth tax, but I'm sure we could find examples from the right. But let's just, as a thought experiment, say that the roles had reversed and Labour and the Greens and Te Pāti Māori were forming a government. Both the Greens and Te Pāti Māori said they would insist on a wealth tax in negotiations. What do you think of that idea? Do you think it would be really democratic to enact a policy like that?
I think it's not so much a question of democracy as the willingness of the major party to concede a policy and the practicality of it. I've got strong views against a wealth tax, but put those to one
just
side.
sort of any policy.
Put those to one side. And let's just say we're proceeding down that path. You'd want to know, how's this going to work? Is it actually going to work? How much is it going to be raised? Frankly, is it worth the effort? Those sorts of considerations. If you're the major party, like Labour in this instance, you'd be wanting to say, well, if we give in on this, and it's not so much a losing face thing, but what impact is it going to have? Is it that big a deal, or is it more a symbolic sort of move? It's almost like throwing them, not crumbs, but some large pieces of cake. And if they concluded that, look, the downside of this is there is some downside for us, but it's far from terminal. It might, but on the other hand, we get their support for, and normally they'd say, well, in return, we'd want you to back us on this, this, and this. It probably balances out in our favour, or it doesn't. I think it's more that than is this the democratic and fair thing to do. It's more, who wins from this, who loses.
It's more
in a political sense.
Well, what are your thoughts on MMP generally? Because obviously you've been a beneficiary of it, and it creates more proportional representation. But then you end up with this weird situation where you don't get exactly what you voted for. You vote for a party and they have their policies, but then you two ticks blue and you end up with black and yellow as a side dish.
Yeah, I think some would say that's a problem. I think it's inevitable. It used to happen under first past the post too, to some extent. You voted for governments who promised to do various things and then went off and did completely the opposite because circumstances have changed. Yeah. I think MMP has provided for better representation of diversity and different viewpoints and aspects of those viewpoints. It will never be perfect. I've always favoured personally STV for the simple reason that everyone gets directly elected at that point. I think you've got a right to vote for your MP. You've also got a right to vote against your MP. And if you vote against your MP and they pop back on Monday because they're high up on the list, that's a bit of a frustration of the process. But I think MMPs work pretty well for New Zealand. I think that we've had stable government by and large. Governments have been able to progress big ideas. There hasn't been that sort of inertia effect that people feared. And I think gradually the politicians and the public, it's taken the best part of 30 years, but gradually we're getting to understand how it works.
Yeah, I think you see it's been a relatively good, in the electorate, it's a good year for MMP. There's been a few minor party wins and a few electorates.
That's, I think, quite a fascinating and encouraging sign, really, because it's not just the two-party monopoly that's being broken. And I think it's really interesting, particularly with the Greens, that the one thing that was always sort of said, for a minor party, it's a waste of time pursuing a two-vote strategy. You're only going to get one. Yeah. And they did that for a long time. We all did. With them now actively pursuing a two-tick strategy, and Act and Tamaki, for instance, it pays a dividend if your candidates are good enough and strong enough. So Act, 1-2 electorates, Greens 1-3. New Zealand First didn't win any, but it's interesting though. But then on the other hand, we sort of have had this election, two quite clearly defined blocks form. Is that in the spirit of MMP too? I think it's inevitable. And funnily enough, you say, well, we've still got the left and the right. We've still got a confrontational parliament. We're never going to get kumbaya. We're never going to get everyone sitting around holding hands making collective decisions. It's always going to be the side with the numbers that wins. I think what's happened is that MMP has made the biases and the contradictions that were inherent in the major parties much more explicit because they've gone off and formed the Greens, New Zealand First, Act, the Māori Party, United Future. Interestingly, I saw a figure just before the election, 106 parties have been formed since MMP was established. Only 6, the ones that I just mentioned, have ever made it to Parliament. Right. So the argument that MMP is going to lead to a sort of a proliferation of minor parties and just not borne out by reality.
Do you support the 5% threshold?
I always favoured 4% and the retention of the one-seat rule. Okay. And the reason is because 4% is still a mighty big hurdle to cross. And I start from the perspective, the Royal Commission recommended that. Parliament said, if 4% is too low, we'll make it 5%. I think that the objective of the Royal Commission was to make it as easy as possible to gain representation without being silly about it. Yeah. And I think that principle's got to be retained. So if you drop the one-seat rule, then I'd say you need to bring the threshold back to maybe 2.5%, 3%. Okay. If you want to keep the threshold at 4 or 5%, then you keep the one-seat rule. Yeah. Because in reality, the number of occasions when the one-seat rule has distorted government have been minimal.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I sort of in principle, don't love the threshold because it feels very hard to cross. But then when I think about, like, if you did away with the threshold, what would have happened, and would I actually have wanted any of those scenarios? It's quite hard.
That's right. You need to draw a line somewhere, but it's got to be one, I think, that doesn't discriminate against reasonable opportunity for political representation.
Yeah. Can I finish with a slightly personal question?
Yep.
You have an iconic look, the bow tie, the sweep of hair. Can I ask about the bow tie? Why wear it, and how did that happen? What's the story? Is there one?
Well, there is a bit, in a way. And it's a boring story.
Okay.
I actually quite liked them. I was never brave enough to start wearing them until one day I thought, what the hell? And that was that. I was sort of an inherent low-key rebel.
Okay.
The other thing was I was sick and tired of spilling food and stuff on ties and having stains, and bow ties are a little harder to stain in that sense. But the funny thing was, when I first started doing so, I was told by a very prominent PR agent, sadly, who's since died, who I respected greatly, that don't do that. You'll only draw attention to yourself. And I thought, well, that's sort of part of the objective if you're in politics, really. So it became my trademark. The hair is absolutely natural. It's just always, it's gone that way, always. People don't believe that. I had the occasion once at the Bolton Hotel in Wellington where a prominent New Zealand businessman, who shall remain nameless, came up and grabbed it and tried to literally scalp me because he believed it was a wig. I was horrified to discover it didn't come off in his hands.
Wow. Okay. Final question. What do you think people most frequently misunderstand about coalition negotiations? What do they get wrong? What does the public miss?
Oh, I think that they in a way, the outcome of coalition leaves everyone sort of equally dissatisfied.
Okay.
Everyone's had to give up something. I think they think that the minor parties have sold their souls. That you should, on the one hand, they want stable, reliable government. On the other hand, you shouldn't sign up with this lot, and you should bring them down at the first possible opportunity, because if you don't, you're just being craven. Right. And if you've accepted a ministerial post, you're not just craven, you're corrupt, all that sort of nonsense. But if you said, well, okay, that's fine, we'll walk out tomorrow and pull the plug, and there'll be an election tomorrow, and then another one in 6 months' time, oh, no, we don't want that. So I think people just misunderstand that these are, they are marriages of convenience. They'll never be perfect, but everyone tries to get the best out of them that they can, and everyone tries to get the best deal for their own particular side that they can. In a way, that's what we do in life anyway.
It feels like the whole point of democracy is about compromise.
Yeah.
And it feels like compromise is going a little bit out of fashion, and sort of partisanship is taking over, and people would rather lose than compromise. Yeah,
I think that's a real fear. And I think over the last few years, that's certainly the way society's moved. That I'm right and you're wrong, and there's no balance between us. But if you take, I'm just trying to think as I talk of a couple of examples, because I know there have been where we've started out, and they would be more particularly with Labour than with National, and that Labour wanting to do something, and we saying to them, well, look, we sort of agree, but not that way, and how you then work out, well, what can we agree on, and you get something that works. I think probably the early days of working for families was like that. Labour wanted to. They didn't want to reform the benefit system per se, but they wanted to give more money to people on low incomes or people who were not so much benefit dependent, but really at the edge. They were not in favour of tax cuts. So how could you do it through a tax credit system? That was what was starting to evolve. We were much more explicitly in favour of tax cuts. And how it worked out was working out that they weren't going to buy tax cuts. So how could you deliver the same thing by different mechanisms? From our perspective, how could you deliver more money in people's pockets? From their perspective, how could you be seen to be sort of reforming the benefit and family assistance systems to be more responsive to family needs? And working for families, which National derided as communism by stealth, and then strengthened and made even more pervasive when they became the government, and now obviously that's continued. Was the result.
Yeah, beautiful. The art of compromise.
It is, and just working through what do you actually want at the end of all of this. The mechanism is secondary to the outcome. If you want to see certain things achieved, and we agree on those, then maybe we need to look at different ways. Are there different ways of getting there that meet our respective objectives?
That's brilliant. Peter Dunne, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you.